Right, welcome to the first workshop in 2016 held by the McDougall Trust. My duty is to start off with the odd housekeeping thing. Those of you who need toilets, you go out the back, walk a few meters, and then turn right, and then try and make sure you do find the right side. It's not that easy, but it's not that difficult either. If the fire bell goes, it's the real thing, and a disembodied voice will tell us what to do. This event is being filmed and will be available on the McDougall Trust website. So if you don't wish your presence here to be known, avoid making sensible remarks in the question time or discussion period later on. And also that means that those who do, and we will be having plenty of time for discussion, those who do should announce and introduce themselves, which means I've got to introduce myself. I'm Michael Steed. I've been a trustee of the McDougall Trust for some nearly 9 years now. In my long ago working life, I was a lecturer in the Department of Government at University of Manchester. I now have a slight link into the politics department at the University of Kent. And let me briefly introduce the Trust. Most of you probably know as much about it as I do, but there are some who may not. The McDougall Trust takes its name from Sir Robert McDougall, the flour miller and philanthropist, who died something like 80 years ago now, leaving a generous bequest to the Historic Proportional Representation Society, which in turn goes back to the 1880s and Gladstone and Leonard Courtney and Sir John Lubbock and all that. The PRS, as it was then, decided to turn this into a charitable trust agreed by the High Court in 1959 with the broad aim of studying the science of government and the specific job of promoting better understanding of the role of electoral systems. We are now an independent charitable trust, defining ourselves as promoting better public understanding of electoral democracy. That's the form of democracy which involves elections in any type or form. We possess an excellent historic library on electoral systems, the Lakeman Library for Electoral Studies, which is open to use by scholars and the curious and historians and the like. Those aren't different categories. At the moment, that is housed in our offices in Vauxhall, which isn't terribly satisfactory, and we are engaged on a hunt for a better permanent home. So if anybody has any ideas on that, do get in touch and let us know. We recently appointed Linda Craig, who I invite now to stand up. She is on a one-year assignment as a development director for us to see how the resources we have and the purpose we see ourselves as having can be brought together to become more effective. And if anybody wants to know more about where she thinks she's going to tell us to go, or we think we're going, do have a word with her afterwards or get in touch by the website or the phone numbers that are available. Anyway, I think that's enough about the trust. On today's topic, I'm just going to go down memory lane. People my age are entitled to do that. My first election that I vividly remember is 1950. There were polls taken in 1950, but they didn't actually indicate the result very well, and they didn't play any real part in the campaign. It was a fantastically exciting Friday after the election, because overnight Labour had a large lead in seats, but everybody said it would come down as the more rural constituencies came in, and nobody had any tools except a little bit David Butler, and he was still an apprentice then. Nobody really had any tools with which to measure the extent to which it was likely to come down. So as results were declared during Friday morning and into Friday afternoon, all my teachers were agog to know whether Attlee was going to be re-elected or Churchill win the election, and I think that's possibly when I caught the bug myself. Shortly after that, psephologists like David Butler and opinion pollsters developed the tools with which it is now possible to predict much more accurately, but every so often the prediction goes slightly awry, and that is of course what John will be talking about. So to introduce John Curtice, if I may, he is one who in this field does need no introduction. His titles and his publications are pretty well known, but I'd like just to introduce him personally, if I may. I've just confirmed with John that our memories are still functioning. We first met exactly 37 years ago at the April conference of the Political Studies Association, and that was the start of some 26 years of, to my mind, very fruitful collaboration between us in research and publication, mainly in the Nuffield election series, but also in other outlets.
You mean you and I had good arguments?
We certainly did at times. And I think we learned to respect each other's points of view.
We did indeed, Michael.
We did indeed. Yes. But what I'd like to just say is that for much of the latter part of that 26 years, I had periods of really quite serious illness and wasn't able to give the input that I would like to have done, and I'd had to retire from my post remarkably young. And I was extremely grateful to John that during those periods he continued to keep me in harness, making best use of me, as I hope he thought, but also giving me more sense of purpose in difficult times than some people have when they are seriously ill. So I owe you a great debt for that personal reason, John. Anyway, John Curtice.
Okay. Is it okay if I stand up for the filming, or do you prefer me to sit down? Is it okay with you if I stand up? Okay, fine, right, okay. So I prefer to harangue people rather than be nice to them, so let me do it this way. Okay, I think probably, I haven't quite, I need to say probably a little bit about the perspective I'm talking from here. As some of you will be aware, I am president of the British Polling Council, which was, together with the Market Research Society, the organisation that set up the inquiry into what happened to the polls in 2015, and that inquiry reported just after Easter. I have inevitably, however, given many a talk on this subject in the meantime. And while I in the inquiry, as it happens, pretty much agree as to what the story is, inevitably I'm just going to tell it in a slightly different way. So I think the first thing to say is most of this talk, I am not talking as President of the British Polling Council. This is me talking personally. And any subtleties of nuance between what I say and what is said in the report should not be interpreted as evidence that I disagree with what the report says, because that is not the case. It's just inevitably we all of us conceptualise things slightly differently. Towards the end, I probably am putting my British Polling Council hat on, because I will give you an idea of how the polls are proposing to respond to the lessons of the inquiry. The inquiry report, by the way, is available on the British Polling Council website, the Market Research Society website, for you to read, and it's just make sure you've got a few happy hours in which to actually do it. Okay, let me first of all, let me just say first of all what I'm going to do. Two things. The title was "Have the Polls Learnt Their Lesson?" So there are two things I clearly need to sort out. One is, what is the lesson? And then two, what are they going to do about it? I'm primarily going to talk about the first of those, but I will talk a little bit about the second towards the end. Okay, how are opinion polls conducted in the UK these days? They are conducted essentially by one of two methods. The first, and this was the 2015 election, was the first at which this was the more common method to be deployed, is basically interviewing people over the internet to a stratified random sample. That is, well, we know how old these people are and what gender they are in advance, but they're all people who in some way or another have volunteered to take part in online surveys. There are a variety of commercial organisations out there which actually try to recruit people into these panels. They use a variety of methods, so it's volunteer in the sense that at the end of the day the person has to sign up, but attempts are made to recruit them into these panels through advertising on dating websites and whatever else you can think of on the internet. But at the end of the day, therefore, it's certainly in no sense necessarily a random sample of the population. And YouGov, who are the biggest of the internet pollsters, maintain their own quite substantial panel. Very little, there's a little bit of people running a poll, and rather than just giving it to a panel, just simply giving it to a panel, also advertising its existence on the web and trying to get people to participate in that way. But that's relatively limited use of that in the UK. The second method is over the telephone to a part random sample, in the sense that the telephone numbers that are rung at random, but when the phone is answered, the respondent who's selected for interview is not selected at random. Basically, if you are less than 30 and you answer the phone and it's ipsos mori at the other end, they'll do their absolute desperate best to try and make sure you answer, because getting hold of younger people is relatively difficult. It's difficult by both methods, but therefore, once the telephone is answered, the interviewers are using a quota. So if there are young people available at the end of the phone, they'll give preference to them. But using both landline and mobile phone numbers these days. So these are the two principal ways of doing it. The basic assumption, a crucial assumption upon which the polling industry has been operating, certainly since 1992, which is the last polling debacle, is an acceptance that they don't necessarily obtain representative samples. They try to obtain representative samples, but there's acceptance that they don't necessarily obtain them, and that the aim of the exercise is to make what may be unrepresented samples look like a representative sample. As a result, what you read in a newspaper in terms of, well, how many people say they're going to vote Conservative, Labour or whatever, is not necessarily the simple, it certainly never is, it never is simply the number of people who said Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrat in response to the poll. First of all polls, and this has been going on for many years, will weight their polls by known demographics. So there are pretty good data out there on the distribution of distribution of population by gender, by age, by social grade, which is what the pollsters use for social class, region, etc. And there are other things they use today. Foreign holidays has long been commonly used in the industry as another measure. So a whole variety of demographics, the more useful of which are the ones that are actually correlated with vote choice. And these days, some things aren't correlated as well as they used to be. But that's an attempt to try, first of all, to ensure that the sample looks demographically representative. Second issue, and we'll come back to quite a lot of this, is most polls ask people how likely you are to vote, and then in some way or another, and there are a variety of ways of doing it, then use that information to try and actually identify what the people who are actually going to vote look like, as opposed to all the people they've interviewed. A key lesson of the 1992 election is that even if you have a sample that's demographically representative, it's not necessarily politically representative, and that therefore there are various ways of it being engaged where the pollsters are essentially trying to weight people to what is thought to be some known distribution of prior political sympathies. The most common of which is how people said they voted the previous election. That's not an unproblematic measure. But it's also, it's certainly been demonstrated that not doing so can certainly cause you trouble. The other thing which some of the polling companies get involved in is, you're not going to tell me how you're going to vote, are you? And the trouble is, if too many of you who won't tell me how you're going to vote are actually going to turn out for one party rather than the other, you're going to send my poll astray. So again, there are various methods out there, and there are actually quite a lot of detail on this in the Enquiry report, about trying to estimate what those who refuse to say what they were going to do are going to do, of which perhaps the most common is, well, if you said to me last time you voted Conservative and you refused to tell me what you're going to do this time, you're probably going to vote Conservative. So all of these things, to varying degrees and somewhat different ways, are being engaged in quite commonly across the industry. All attempts to turn samples that themselves may not be representative. Virtually every opinion poll has too few younger people in it. Virtually every opinion poll has too few working class people in it. Pretty much every opinion poll has too many people who actually turn out to the polling, who actually go out and vote in elections in it. And I think that's something we'll come back to. But attempts to try to overcome these underrepresentativeness by weighting the data to what are thought to be known, reliable population parameters. And in a sense, a major question facing the industry in the wake of the experience of 2015 is whether actually that strategy is adequate or not, and that will become more obvious as we go along. Okay, what's the problem? The problem is, of course, here. The polls did a brilliant job of getting the UKIP relatively new UKIP vote. They did a good job on the Lib Democrat collapse. They did well on getting the rise of the Greens. They did pretty well on the SNP north of the border. But of course, given we have a first past the post electoral system, relatively small errors in these numbers can result in a very, very different political story. It is worth reminding, if you'd commissioned me to do some business research, and I said to you that actually 35% of people will buy your product within 2 years, and in the end it proved to be 30%, you probably reckon you spent your money pretty well. You've got a pretty good idea of your likely success in the market and how the proposed marketing strategy would work. But if I go out there and tell you that 35% of people are going to vote Labour and only 30% do so, you say, God, that's complete crap, it's completely wrong. I mean, the result now looks completely different. But it's undoubtedly, this is the thing that above all the polls have to get right. And if they don't get it right, it's where certainly if the result is relatively close or thought to be relatively close, can result in a political story which looks to be very different from the one that eventually transpires. One of the debates undoubtedly was going on in the campaign, indeed this debate that's still going on, is about the relative merits of phone versus internet sampling. And that debate is certainly lively at the moment because of the differences between them in the EU referendum. So far as the final polls are concerned, this is simply now the averages of the final polls, very little difference. They're both essentially in the same boat. Though you'll notice the Tories doing very slightly better in the phone polls. And if you go back earlier in the campaign, there did tend to be something of a tendency of the phone polls being slightly more generous to the Conservatives and perhaps therefore maybe closer to the truth. The one difference there was before them, however, and it's relevant to what's going on now, was UKIP. They, throughout consistently, internet polls have been finding more UKIPers than have phone polls, which is right. Well, actually, the UKIP total was 13, so they're both wrong. But in other words, we ended up halfway between what the phone polls were estimating and what the internet polls were estimating, which actually is a 3-point gap that's also replicated in the ISM experiment on phone versus internet sampling for the European Union referendum. So you can see, and again, they have also a 4-point difference on EU referendum voting intention. So the best guide you can get from the general election as to which polls to believe in the EU referendum is to split the difference, but who knows. Now, this issue of underestimating the Conservatives and overestimating Labour is not a new one, and it's a point that's emphasised in the report. This is a much simpler version that's in the report. This is the débâcle of 1992. But actually, 1997, the polls again underestimated the Conservatives and overestimated Labour. The same was true in 2001. But nobody noticed, because all you needed to do in those elections was to give Labour a big number, and nobody bothered to look at the detail. Because the polls were giving you the right story, albeit they were exaggerating the story. 2010, a little different. Labour doing so badly may be underestimated, but even so, it's not the Tories being overestimated. And the truth is that if you actually read what some, I mean, if we read, I'm particularly picking on Peter, but Peter, if you actually read Peter Kellner's seat predictions in the Sunday Times, they were not in accordance with YouGov polls. Peter, like pretty much everybody else, was saying, you know what, I know that most of the time the polls tend to underestimate the Tories and overestimate Labour, so I'm going to add a point or two. But the difficulty for all of us was, well, is it a point or two, or is it a lot more than that? In the end, it proved to be a lot more than that, and that, in a sense, is therefore why very few people anticipated the Tories would actually get an overall majority. There are other things that are going on behind that anyway. So this is not just a short-term, sudden problem in 2015. It's a persistent problem. It's a persistent problem even though the way in which polls are conducted now is completely different from the way in which they were conducted in 1992. In 1992, we were still talking about face-to-face quota sampling. Interviewers going out, knocking on people's doors in a predefined place and having to find so many young people, so many older people, so many women, etc., etc. The methods have completely changed, but the problem has persisted. Okay. What are the possible explanations? I'm not going to try to explain the long-term problem, but let's look at the short-term problem. this is the way I would conceptualise it, and it's very similar to what's in the report, though it's very slightly different. One, and these are essentially in the order in which the pollsters would prefer them to be true. Every pollster would love to believe that despite the fact that they kept on polling until 6 o'clock on the Wednesday before polling day, that at around 8 o'clock in the evening, a Damascene conversion occurred across many a household in Britain, and as a result, people switched to voting for the Tories. The second is, it's not our fault, it's the respondents' fault. The Tories wouldn't tell us what they were going to do, they refused, or the Labour folk told us they were going to go out and vote, and in fact they stayed at home. The fourth one gets more difficult. It's, well, yeah, it is our fault, but it's our fault because we asked the questions in the wrong order. This was something that came out of, this James Morris suggested, claiming that Labour's private polling, which, by the way, has never been publicly released, and I have heard Labour politicians give a rather different slant on their private polling, but who knows who's right. But James Morris at least claiming that actually the Labour Party knew that it was in trouble because in the private polls, rather than asking people first of all, which is what most pollsters do, how you're going to vote, and then maybe ask other questions, they started off with, well, who can run the economy best? What do you think of Ed Miliband? And then they asked people how they're going to vote, and having reminded people how badly Labour Party were at running the economy and being what they thought of Ed Miliband, they therefore succeeded in depressing the Conservative vote. The Labour vote. Finally, the one that the pollsters would prefer not to be true is that basically they were interviewing the wrong people. That the samples they got were indeed unrepresentative. They were not adequately weighted in order to correct for the unrepresentatives, and perhaps the problem is such that maybe the problem cannot easily be overcome. Who knows? First of all then, I'm not dealing with it within that order, I'm dealing with it in a slightly different order. Let's first of all deal with the question order effect. It so happens that the British Election Study, which is running a mega internet panel from February 2014 through to probably now about 2017, in some of their early ways of this panel, they asked some people how they were going to vote very early in the questionnaire, literally about the third question, and the other half of the sample much later in the questionnaire. Okay? So we've got independent evidence about whether or not question order made a difference to the distribution of vote intentions. And the answer is, it doesn't. This is the distribution in the February 2014 panel wave. It was Labour 38, Conservative 31. This was this is amongst the people who were asked the vote intention at the beginning of the survey. These are the ones who were asked at the end. They're 38, 32. There's no difference here. So that one's gone out the window. The second one is about shy Tories. This is the folk who don't tell you what they're going to do are more likely to be Conservative voters. Now, one of the things I have had access to, and therefore I'm focusing on particularly, is ICM's recall survey. ICM went back to the people they interviewed during the election and asked them what they actually did. ICM is one of the companies that's particularly strong on trying to deal with shy Tories. And they do it essentially by saying, if you tell me what you told me last time you were a Tory, I reckon you're a Tory this time. As you can see, so this is how ICM actually allocated the people who refused. They estimated that 40% of their refusers were Tories. And if you believe what the people told ICM after the election, 40% of them indeed did vote Conservative. ICM actually slightly underestimated Labour and overestimated the number of Lib Dems that would return home. At the end of the day, there were indeed lots of Lib Dems out there who were going, am I really going to vote for Nick Clegg again, given what happened over tuition fees? But in the end, actually, most of them didn't, even despite their uncertainty. But at least so far as this gap's concerned, A, ICM have dealt with it, and B, they've dealt with it reasonably well. Now, there's another section of people out there who not only refuse to tell you what you did this time, but also refuse to tell you what you did last time. And I think ICM's view is now that they didn't deal adequately with that. And the report, however, basically says, yeah, you know, we can see from the recall exercises of all the companies that, yes, those people who didn't tell the pollsters what they're going to do last time were more likely to vote Conservative, but it's a small effect. And in ICM's case and a number of other companies' case, like Lord Ashcroft, actually they've already tried to deal with the problem, but they ended up in the same boat. So this certainly cannot be a major explanation of what's going on. The lazy Labour thesis, however, has a bit more mileage to it, but we have to distinguish between two versions of this thesis, one of which begins to merge into the argument about sampling. Version number one is that people who said to the pollsters, we're Labour voters, didn't go to the polls. The second version is that the polls were too successful at getting Labour voters who did indeed go to the polls, but undersampled Labour supporters who didn't go to the polls. All right. So one is a did the people do what they said they were going to do issue. The other is actually were they interviewing the wrong type of people type of issue. The reason why the pollsters quite rapidly got onto this issue immediately after the election is one of the things that they discovered is that there were a lot more people in their polls who said that they were certain to vote. But actually the turnout was virtually the same. So this is one of the reasons why this became something that the polling industry itself focused on, let alone the Enquiry, because they were saying, hang on, we suddenly seem to have got more people who were going out to vote. So maybe this is the problem. Maybe actually the Labour voters didn't go out to vote. Well, two things to bear in mind here. The first is we can actually look to see whether or not the final polls were or were not anticipating that Labour voters would stay at home. To which the answer is some of them weren't. These are the ones at this end of this graph. But some of them were. The ones on the right-hand side of this graph. Survation were, panel-based were, ICM were. They were saying our data shows that Labour voters in our sample have a lower propensity to turn out and vote. But they're all in the same. But they all end up with the same error in the polls. So this cannot be central to what's going on. And indeed, the Enquiry's got much more on this, and I've got time to get into here. But these are people are asked to say how likely they are to vote on a scale from 1 to 10. All right. So if you give yourself a 10, you're expected to be certain to vote. If you're down here, you're very unlikely to vote. The calibration is not perfect, but my reading of this is actually it wasn't that bad. In other words, people who said they were 8 out of 10 certain to vote, 80% of them actually said they went to the polling station. The Enquiry has done much more modelling of this, and it's somewhat unsure that actually the calibration was that good. But the difficulty is there aren't very many people down at this end of the spectrum in the recall samples. But in any event, the Enquiry again says it's not turnout. I mean, even if the polls had accurately identified who was going to vote and who wasn't going to vote in advance of polling day, they would still have had pretty much the same error that they actually had. And indeed, what's also clear from some of these recall exercises is that the Labour voters who were in the pollsters' samples were just as likely to go out and vote as were the Conservative voters in their sample. But notice how high these propensities are. Most of the people who were in the polls were just going out to the polls on polling day. So there isn't evidence here that the people who the pollsters were interviewing didn't make it to the polling station. However, what is undoubtedly the case is that the polls were underestimating the age gap in turnout. And you'll see in a moment why I'm focusing on age. Here are the estimated differences in turnout by two academic surveys that are done in a very, very different way from the polls. These, one's British Election Study face-to-face sample, the other's British Societies, which I'm very heavily involved in. These are random probability surveys. These are surveys where interviewers are told, you've got a knock on that door with this address, and when the door is answered, you've got to find out everybody who lives there, and then the computer will tell you who you've got to interview, and if you don't succeed the first time, try again. These are pure statistical random probability samples, all right? It's the way that statistical theory should do it. This is also an estimate from Murray based on trying to look at the election results as to what the age gap in turnout was and modelling their polling data. These here are some examples of the estimated age gap. So younger people are less likely to turn out than older people, but as you can see, the estimated difference between younger and older people in their probability of voting is actually lower than all of the really good survey evidence, and British Social Attitudes pretty much has the turnout spot on so far as the proportion of the sample who says they actually voted. Equally, again, you can see the difference. This is now the British election study, which is already, as I already said, running an internet panel done by YouGov, much like a poll, but also face-to-face probability sample. The internet sample has very, very little in the way of a difference in reported turnout. The face-to-face sample has a much bigger gradient. Why does this matter? It matters because one of the crucial features of the 2015 election is that there was a divergent swing between age groups. Younger people moved towards Labour. Older people moved towards the Conservatives. The age gap in vote choice was about as big as I've seen it in, 37 years you told me I've been doing this job. Therefore, if you were underestimating the age gap in turnout, the risk that the young people you were interviewing were not representative. What you were getting were the young people who were, yes, voting Labour, like their fellow comrades, who were actually going to go to the polling station. And you're not picking up the fact that lots of other younger people who, if they had gone to the polling station, would have voted Labour, but actually were never ever going to get there. Therefore, you end up with too many Labour voters in your sample. So you can see how this gets into a sampling issue. And almost undoubtedly, one of the crucial lessons of the 2015 election, which I think an implicit assumption that most pollsters had, which is it doesn't matter whether you get the turnout right. It doesn't matter if you only get people who are actually going to go to the polling station, because if you get the people going to the polling station, you're going to find out what's going to happen. That assumption, I think, has now been heavily questioned. And indeed, what some of the pollsters have discovered, with a wonderful benefit of hindsight, is that if they reweight their data according to some of these other estimates of how many people voted in each age group, etc., they got the result roughly right. Yeah, just a pity they couldn't tell us beforehand, but there we go. Finally, before coming back to sampling, late swing. Is there much evidence that people changed their minds? The answer is no. This is ICM's recall sample. 32% of ICM samples said that they were going to vote Conservative before polling day. 33% said they did. There's a very small swing here. There's a 1% swing from Tory to Labour, but it's small. It's not very big. Equally, this is the big BES internet sample. They have 35-35 during the election campaign. They have 35-35 afterwards. So at best, there is limited evidence that there was a late swing, unsurprisingly. And this, in a sense, is really the killer so far as it being anything other than sampling. There were five exercises. There were 5 published exercises of pollsters going back to the people they'd interviewed before the election, and then weighting and filtering their data in exactly the same way as they would have done in a pre-election poll, and they still didn't get the election result right. Okay, ICM still only had a 1-point lead in their recall exercise. Opinion had them even-Stevens. Populists had them even-Stevens. The British election studies you've already seen had them even-Stevens. Survation are the only company that begin to actually get anything very much in the way of a Conservative lead, and they are the exception rather than the rule. So going back, redoing their polling, the pollsters, even after the election, if they were weighting their data in the way they were before the election, could not get the result right. They can only get the result right if they use side information to weight their data differently. And indeed, the other thing which I think is absolutely fascinating, for all the attempts of the pollsters to weight and filter their data, if you actually go back to the original unweighted data, absolutely unweighted, and you can do this because all the polling data is out there, they had 34-34. And they ended up with 34-34. So all the attempts they were making to make their samples representative weren't working. So the question, therefore, is it possible, using other methods, to get the result right? To which the answer is yes. I've already explained to you, both the British election study and British social attitudes went and used random probability sampling. It's terribly expensive. It takes weeks. But here's the election result. Here is what the British election study face-to-face random probability sample says if you weight the data, just to make sure the age and gender profiles are right. This is what you get if you don't weight the data, but as you can see, the weighting is not crucial. So in reality, there's a 7-point lead. With weighting the data, you have an 8-point lead, and if you don't weight the data, you have an 8-point lead. The levels are not quite right, and there's an issue about underestimating UKIP. But so far as the thing that the polls got wrong, the Conservative voters were there to be found, and they were to be found after polling day. So although the pollsters couldn't find them, this academic survey did. Equally, the British Social Attitude Survey, which I'm involved in, very, very similar findings. So again, here's the real election result. There is an 8-point lead in the unweighted data, and there is an 8-point lead in the weighted data. So, but two academic exercises done utterly independently by two different organisations manages to find the punters. And as I already said, British Social Attitude's also got the turnout actually spot on as well. But again, a bit light on UKIP voters, which is an area. Now, one of the things that the question therefore arises, so what is it about random probability sampling that enables you to find Conservative voters that the methods that the pollsters are using apparently could not do so? Well, here British Social Attitudes in particular gives a clue, and it's not the first time this issue has been raised. It was raised after the 1992 election as well. Basically, Tories are just harder to find. Maybe they've got better things to do in life than to answer opinion polls. Probably slightly more seriously, they tend to be more affluent and maybe therefore spend more of their leisure time out of the home. But whatever, this is the clue. Because British Social Attitudes, literally, I mean, interviewers may knock on somebody's door as much as 9 occasions in order to try and get an interview, okay? So we can break down the data according to how many times did you have to knock on somebody's door before you got a completed interview. These are the folk who said, oh, come in, yes, lovely. First time, they were in when the interviewer knocked, and they said, fine, yes, absolutely, I'll do this hour-long interview right now. They've got nothing else to do. They're Labour voters. And actually, the Labour voters, even though they're disproportionately older, so actually, if you were to weight the data according to demographics, the gap would be even bigger. You have to knock on the door twice and you begin to find the Conservative voters, but actually, it's only really when you begin to knock on the door 3 or more times that the Conservative voters turn up. It turns around here, but there aren't very many people who get these many calls. Equally, the British election study, again, once you weight the data by demographics, there's a similar story. First call respondents are not typical. And therefore, certainly, the length of fieldwork period, the amount of effort you actually make to try to get hold of people is arguably important. The problem, of course, the polls face, British Social Attitudes took 4 months. British election study about 2 to 3 months. These are slow academic surveys, and they cost. These are 6-figure sums. They're very expensive. So there's a problem of time and there's a problem of cost. But as you can see, the problem that for the polling industry is that time and cost and method may actually matter. Okay, so those are the lessons. It's sampling, basically. That the pollsters were not interviewing representative samples for reasons that we're beginning to understand, and that therefore it's the tough end of the answers that they have. So what's happening? So I'll now put my BPC hat on. The Enquiry makes 5 recommendations so far as method is concerned. 3 of them are relatively minor, and one of them really is about closing the stable door before the horse bolts. One very narrow technical point. Look, some people, quite a lot of people, by the time you're polling towards the end of a campaign, have voted by post. Why are you bothering to ask them your likelihood of voting? Find out where they voted by post and don't ask them like, well, that's a kind of obvious thing, but it's not going to make a real difference.
They could have filled the forms in wrong and the vote not be
Well, but that's also true of the people who answer the surveys afterwards, right?
It's much higher for postal votes.
Well, I know, that I understand, sure, but okay. Here, they could also, there's a recommendation, they try to do more about trying to estimate who is actually likely to turn out and vote. The view of the inquiry is that the methods, which are just basically asking people, are not particularly robust. And they also think, it's going back to the Shy Tories point, that at the moment the methods for doing this are rather ad hoc, and more work should be done on trying to improve that. But these are all dealing with things that are around the edges of the problem rather than things that are central to it. What it also basically says is you have to think about sampling, unsurprisingly. The first thing it says is, in an ideal world, you need to try to work to obtaining more representative samples. And I say within weighting stratification cells. So the point is, you actually need to make sure that you not only have to have the right number of young people, but actually that the young people you interview are actually typical. All right, that's what that means. How is that to be done? Well, basically by taking longer about it. That whereas at the moment, have you ever noticed how wonderful it is? The telephone surveys manage to interview exactly 1,000 people. It's brilliant. I mean, they really must be very good at estimating their response rates. No, of course they're not. Basically, they keep on ringing until they've got 1,000 people, and then they go, hallelujah, right? So they're not necessarily putting a lot of effort into ringing the number that wasn't answered before. So therefore, the inquiry is also saying you need to get more effort to get non-responsive. This essentially is learning the lessons of the apparent availability bias. The pressure, of course, is that the journalistic community tends to say, well, if that survey is more than 2 days old, it's worth no more than chip paper. And therefore, news values come into conflict with the kind of length of time that's required to do polling. And this is also expensive. Spending longer about doing something means you have to spend more money on doing it. So again, there's a cost issue here. But that's recommendation number one. Recommendation number two is, as it were, coming at it slightly the other way, is to say, well, look, okay, the other thing you might want to think by doing is that try to think of more things that are correlated with the probability that people will answer a survey and which way they're likely to vote. So it's things like the discovery in the past that asking foreign holidays is quite a good idea. So far, the industry has not done much about this. Quite a lot of this is going on, of companies trying to ask more questions about people in order to get a better handle on the representative of their samples in order to see if they can improve things. What in particular, however, it recommends, this then has implications for the academic community, is to say that perhaps in particular what is required is that you need to ensure that there are indeed high-quality random probability surveys against which to benchmark your measures. And to give an example of what can mean, one of the experiments to try to find out what went wrong, what the difference between the phone and the internet polls, was actually to ask some questions that were on the British election study face-to-face sample, on basically attitudes towards social conservatism, which is known to be correlated with attitudes towards the EU, and then using that to look at the character of the phone and the internet samples, to discover basically that the internet samples were too socially conservative and the phone samples were too socially liberal, and that therefore again maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle. But that therefore there's the polling industry, if it's going to try to do things in a relatively quick and dirty fashion, does need to be underpinned by much more expensive survey work to then use to try to calibrate these samples to make them representative. And that also has implications for the funding council. It says basically you definitely should be funding random probability work in advanced election, probably also making much more use of random probability internet panels, of which the National Centre certainly has the beginning of one, but has not yet been much used. Now, what you need to realise, the British Polling Council is an organisation that promotes transparency, it promotes understanding, a bit like the McDougall Trust. It's not a methodological policeman. Not least of the reasons because if I were to go around and say that Ipsos Mori survey is wrong and that ICM one is right, we might end up being taken to court by Ipsos Mori, and we don't have the money to be taken to court by. But clearly, the industry collectively needs to be seen to be responding to these inquiry recommendations. So what therefore the BPC has agreed is that in the autumn of 2019, in advance of the next election, I'm now assuming at the moment the next election in 2020, that it will issue a report and hold a seminar at which all the companies will say, this is what we've done, this is how we've changed, this is how we've responded to the inquiry, this maybe also is what we've done on the basis of our own ideas, this is how we're doing things differently. Doesn't mean to say they will be right, but at least hopefully everybody will A, see what the industry has done and can come to their own conclusion as to whether or not they have responded adequately. B, everybody should be able to have clear access to information about how the polls are being conducted in 2020. So that's one half of the inquiry report. Now, the inquiry was also asked, however, to say how the rules of the British Polling Council should be changed. Did there need to be more in the way of transparency or the role and the remit of the council? And there are recommendations there, which I put on this slide. One is that the companies should be required to put more information about how they've weighted their data, particularly the targets to which they're trying to weight, than they're required to do at the moment. That they should always state very clearly whenever they have changed the way in which they adjust or weight their data as compared with their previous poll. And that also, I think this is a more technical piece, is that if there's another inquiry into the opinion polls, that the companies are required to give that inquiry the individual level data. There was no problem about that at this inquiry. The inquiry actually does point out that, unlike the industry in the US, every single polling company has provided the inquiry with all of the data that it requested and has been completely transparent and cooperative about this inquiry. Now, those three recommendations, the BPC has already agreed to rewrite the rules as rapidly as possible in order to make those requirements necessary. So that's fairly straightforward. Let me then go to the bottom two. The two other recommendations which the academics amongst you will prove heartily of. One is that the companies should provide confidence intervals for each party so far as estimating vote intention is concerned, and should also provide significance tests for changing party vote share. This is really an attempt to try to say to journalists, look, if the Labour vote's gone 1 point up, the headline is not Labour storm into the lead. It's actually, nothing's really changed. Or at least nothing we can be sure of has really changed. We'll see how journalists react to that. But at least the information should be there. Now, what here the BBC has decided is that, well, yeah, you're absolutely right, but there therefore should be a common way of calculating this, and the inquiry says, look, clearly some work is going to be required on this. So basically, the industry is now going away collectively to work out, given the methods it's using, what are credible confidence intervals, and to agree a common set of confidence intervals and methods for calculating in future. And hopefully that will kick in early next year. The final recommendation is that the companies should pre-register if they're undertaking a poll with BPC, i.e. they're required to send me something like that. They have to send me an email saying, by the way, John, we're just about doing an opinion poll. That's something where the officers of the BPC have been instructed to go away and identify a way of trying to see what the inquiry is trying to achieve can be achieved within the resources of the council. So that's for further discussion. But basically, as you can see, as a result of all of this, which Michael was showing me something from France about how Parliament's legislating, we're not legislating, but the inquiry, the industry collectively will indeed be expected to be even more transparent than it already is. And that's me done.
Well, thank you very much, John. Something from France was that last week the French Parliament, on a backbenchers motion, slipped into a law on the electoral rules for the presidency, something of the recommendations on that final slide about transparency to be enforced on polling organisations by law. What John is doing is leading a self-regulation Quango type body, but not really Quango. More.
It's nothing to do with government.
No,
at
it's
all.
nothing
Absolutely.
to do with government.
No,
really.
it's civil society.
Civil society is the right word.
I'm sure, as a liberal, Michael, you would heartily approve of this.
Well, I just think it's extremely interesting that the same. No, similar problems occur in two neighbouring countries,
Oh, sure.
and the political culture of the one, in terms of self-regulation or state regulation, is so different from the other. Anyway,
Yeah, though, bear in mind, George Fuggs has been trying to legislate in this area.
unsuccessfully.
Yes.
Right.
Fortunately, Lord's private members' bills struggle to get very far, especially if the government's opposed. But anyway.
Well, anyway.
But the pressure is there. I mean, the politicians are knocking on the door saying, if you can't sort yourself out, we might sort you out for you.
Right. We now move into discussion and question and answer. John has got an appointment at 3 o'clock across St James's Park, and if he's going to walk fast and not get there too breathless, he needs to walk out of this room by 22:03. The room is actually booked until just after 3, so those who want to will be able to linger and chat to each other. Could I just remind us that this is being filmed, so those who chip in with questions, please say who you are and announce any institutional connection or relevant role. You don't have to, you can just be an anonymous individual, and above all, speak clearly. I saw Keith Sharp's hand going up first.
Thank you, Michael. Keith Sharp, I'm a council member of the Electoral Reform Society. And your presentation, John, and perhaps I should say commercially as well, I've worked quite a lot with market research firms over the years, and your point about a few points difference in the commercial world doesn't make that much difference because it's a guide rather than an absolute. But in a way, I found what you were dealing with, there were sort of insurmountable problems given the variables and all that, unless you spend huge amounts of money, take huge amounts of time, as you just said, and what newspaper is going to do that in the run-up to an election. I think I have a question, two questions for you. One is, the pride of the polling industry aside, does it matter? How influential are opinion polls, even when they get it wrong, on the actual election result? I suspect they are important, actually, for various reasons, perhaps more than they used to be. So, if it is going to be difficult to resolve the issue, and if opinion polls do influence the result, is there not a case for saying, sorry everybody, but for a period of time, 1 week or 2 weeks, whatever it is, before the actual election, there will be a moratorium on publishing of opinion polls?
Okay. You can ban people from publishing opinion polls via internet sites and material published in the UK. You cannot ban the publication of opinion polls. All right. France has faced this issue. France used to have a ban of 7 days, and what happened is the newspapers bought themselves websites in Switzerland and put them up on the web anyway. I mean, see the whole thing at the moment about I don't even know who the flipping threesome is, but there's a threesome which I, as living in Scotland, I'm allowed to know about, but south of the border you're not. But of course, given the internet, all you need to do is to be able to find a Scottish website, and hey, you can find out what the whole story is about. The truth is, in the days of the internet, you cannot ban the publication of opinion polls. What you can do is to create an insider market in opinion polls. Michael probably remembers Bill Johnson in the days that he was interested in French politics. Back in the days when the French did ban polls for 7 days, Bill Johnson had access to the polls of the Parti Socialiste, and he rang up his wife and said, "You need to put a lot of money on Mitterrand because he's going to win." All right. So what I don't understand, so you're creating an insider market in which the finance houses will know what's going on because they can afford to pay for opinion polls. The political parties will know what's going on because they can afford to pay for opinion polls. Those who are sufficiently savvy to spend time on the internet will know what's going on. The only people who won't know are the ordinary punters. All right. So that's number one. A, you can't do it, and B, you create an unequal market in information. And I struggle to see how, as a Labour politician, George Fuggs can actually wish to promote relative advantage for the financial world. That's number one. Number two, on does it matter? Well, there's a lot of misconception about the consequences of the opinion polls error in 2015. I mean, let me put it this way. As I understand the Labour Party argument, if only we'd been behind in the opinion polls, then we would have won the election. Now, once you put it like that, you begin to realise the folly of their position. Now, it's a slightly more subtle argument of that, of course. What the argument is, well, if the opinion polls had been right, we wouldn't have been arguing about whether or not Labour would have done a deal with the SNP. Instead, people would have been saying, oh, those nasty Tories are going to be in government, we can't have that, we need to do something about it. However, this is a misunderstanding of what the story would have been if the polls had been right. So let's assume that on average, the opinion polls had said it was a 7-point lead. Now, if you do the standard noddy arithmetic, which is the way in which most opinion polls work out, most people use opinion polls to work out seat projections, you would have come up with Tory 320. Meanwhile, so you would not have been, your central forecast would not have been a Tory majority. The Tories only got a majority at the end of the day because they did exceptionally well in marginal seats for reasons that Michael could explain eloquently, because he's one of the first people to write about it. But it was unequal swing in marginal seats, which you cannot get out of any opinion poll at all, is central to the Tories' majority. And that's number one. Therefore, and then also take into account that, of course, there will be variation around that 7-point average. So we would have had some polls saying it's a 2-point lead, it's a 3-point lead, and we would have had speculation about all Cameron's had it, blah, blah, blah. And yes, we would have had other polls that said that the Tories were going to get a majority. But therefore, the crucial point is there would still have been speculation about what might happen in a hung parliament and who would deal with whom. It just simply wouldn't have been the only speculation. But the idea that the error in the polls completely reframed the election debate is actually wrong. Next point I will make to which comes back to think, did it make a difference? Well, we have very little evidence on whether or not the Labour SNP, the claims that the SNP would help the Labour Party made much difference. But we do have two. One is the polls were wrong, but it's probably true that the errors were constant during the election campaign. Nothing happened in the 2015 election campaign. Basically, the polls were saying exactly the same thing at the end as they said at the beginning. All right, number one. Second piece of evidence we have is the British Election Internet Panel study did actually ask people, both, I think it was in January 2015 and March 20, and during the election campaign, anyway, before the campaign started and during the campaign. And it asked people, do you think Labour and the SNP might do a deal with each other? It was already the case before the election campaign started that 50% of people said, you know what, they might. So that perception was already quite widely out there and therefore priced into the market. Now that number does go up. That number goes up from 50% to 60% from before the campaign to during the campaign. So the perception becomes wider. But do those people who came to the realization that such a deal actually swing to the Tories? Answer, no. Their voting behaviour looks exactly the same once they've got the realisations beforehand. Now, it's not perfect evidence. The wording of the question is not exactly what we want for the situation. But such evidence as we have actually suggests that this is not the reason why the Tories won. The Tories won because they're always going to win, and they managed to avoid losing very much during the election campaign. More broadly, do the polls make a difference? Well, in some ways they can. I mean, clearly in Scotland they did, in that a minority, but it can make a difference, of voters voted tactically against the SNP. And perhaps in Edinburgh South and one or two other places might have made a difference. So it can have an impact there. But more broadly, the evidence, the academic papers which kind of try to work out, well, do people follow the party, vote for the party that's ahead because they love to be in with the consensus, or do they vote for the underdog because they feel unhappy for them? Well, pretty much for every academic paper that you'll find saying that there is an underdog effect, you'll find another one saying there's a bandwagon effect. Maybe sometimes it works in one direction, maybe sometimes in the other, but it's very difficult to find consistent evidence that the polling is making a difference to the overall support of the parties.
But might, John, if it had been known the Tories were well ahead, but on the edge of either winning or not winning an overall majority, might not there have been a bit more tactical voting amongst the anti-Conservative parties in England?
Maybe. But the truth is, of course, there weren't many Liberal Democrats left to vote tactically, Michael, in the first place.
Too.
And a few, but given the relative weakness of the other centre-left parties, the ability of tactical voting to make much difference is inevitably going to be much more limited.
Sure. Let's come to Tom, and we'll work
Tom
round.
Walsh, trustee of the McDougall Trust. John, either I've misunderstood something, or the situation is perhaps more serious than you suggested. You put up one chart which said that all polls except observation couldn't get close to the actual results.
Absolutely,
even after making modifications.
No, not after modifications.
Oh,
This is not making a modification. This is literally doing what they did before the election, but going back to the people they interviewed afterwards and then weighting the data in exactly the same way, and they end up basically still. I mean, they don't find any late swing, and they end up, therefore, with an election result that still looks even Stevens. Right, so the crucial difference is the polls going back to people end up still with it as a 50-50 shot between Conservative and Labour if the data are weighted in the same way as they were before. If they start weighting it differently, which is what I'm showing you here, then they can get rather closer, because now they're using side evidence to estimate differences in the propensity of different social groups to vote for the various parties. Or alternatively, you go and spend many, many thousands of pounds and you get it right.
Okay, yes, next. You, yes. Yes, you. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Sorry, Joshua Carrington, I work for the Labour Party. First of all, on the SNP thing, I agree with you for the most part. I did do some research into this directly after the election, and while the BES is fantastic in a great many ways, one of the very unfortunate things is it doesn't ask the question about how you feel towards a particular party, in this case the SNP. And they did have a question about being afraid, and I'd be interested to see, although obviously it's not possible to sell, whether or not over time people's perception of fear and association with that idea of the SNP did increase, and that might have had an effect and driven in some part the media narrative. But what I'd actually like to...
Yeah, but you still got the basic problem. We have no evidence of a shift in the aggregate level of party support, right? Okay. So if it had an effect, then somewhere else along the line, Labour was gaining votes.
Of course, and I suppose that it goes down to more how the parties react to the media narrative and what tactical decisions they make later on in the campaign.
Sure, that of course is
which
that.
is
Of course,
obviously more difficult because
yeah.
there's
no counterfactual evidence. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry, what I was actually going to ask was I've noticed I read the Enquiry paper.
Yeah.
And I noticed it did touch briefly on the marked register, and now I don't know to what degree polling companies have access to the marked register, but I'd be curious to know whether or not you think that more representative samples would capture the entirety of the difference in terms of the turnout differential between age groups, or whether or not it might be more useful or more predictive to actually model out on the basis of the marked register.
Yeah, I get what you get at. Younger people particularly are likely to be on the register. That's been a long-standing problem, arguably made worse by IER. Some of the companies, particularly in their final polls, do ask people, as long as you know, do you know whether you're on the register or not, in order to try and deal with this problem. And certainly, if you look at Ipsos Mori's data, you can see that does take out a whole chunk of younger people. But otherwise, within this length of time that they have to do these things, probably you're not going to do much more than that.
I mean, after the election, so you get a copy of the marked register and you see who's voted and who hasn't.
Well, yeah, the British Election Study, of course, does that and goes out and. But what are you expecting to pick up? I mean,
Well, but in terms of
most of the research. I mean, having originally started this 20 years ago, basically the marked register evidence shows you that the polls, well, that at least the random probability surveys are not as inaccurate as you might think, because, of course, the estimate of turnout that you get officially is always an underestimate of the real level of turnout, because there are lots of people who are on the, some people are on the register twice and other people are dead and all the rest of it. So because of the redundancy in the register, the actual level of turnout is always, of people who could actually make it to the polling station, is always actually higher. And once you allow for that, people's reports, not too bad in the aggregate.
Colin.
You've not talked much about the Liberal Democrat performance, because one of the things that puzzles me is why the party did quite so badly, given that during the earlier parts of the coalition there was quite a lot of evidence and support for the idea that the party was holding up its vote more in its areas of strength than elsewhere, and that clearly didn't happen now.
Yes, it did.
It did.
It did.
Well, no, it didn't.
Yes, it did.
The
Yes,
vote
it
held
did.
up.
Yes, it did.
Some of the seats lost were lost by enormous majorities.
Okay, right. Sorry, we're really aroused. I mean, one of the things that I can well remember Steve Fisher standing up at a British Election Study conference and saying, "Look, if your vote is going down by 16 points." And in about 150 constituencies, you didn't even get 16% of the vote last time. It must be true that your vote is going down more in places where you were previously strongest. And that is exactly what the analysis of the British Election Study Panel survey in advance of the election showed. What, however, then was also true is that in constituencies where the Liberal Democrats did have an incumbent MP, the fall in the vote was less than in comparable constituencies in terms of vote strength where there wasn't an incumbent MP, right? But all that therefore meant was that on average, the fall in the vote in seats being defended by Liberal Democrats was pretty much in line with the fall in the National Party's vote rate. So you know, you've got two counteracting things going on here. One is the Liberal Democrat vote is arithmetically inevitably going down more in places where they're previously strongest. However, that's not true of the places where the MPs were trying to defend their seats. But it does therefore mean that these two things cut across each other, that the average Liberal Democrat MP suffers a fall in vote share of around 14, 15 points, more or less in line with the party's vote share.
That doesn't explain the 7 of the votes of the seats that were held. It doesn't explain Orkney and Shetland. But the others were a random selection.
Well, Orkney and Shetland was the last.
That's why
If you did the naughty arithmetic in Scotland, Orkney and Shetland was always the one seat that the Democrats were going to hang on to.
Colin, it explains Westmoreland. It explains Westmoreland, which was a very heavy vote. The other thing that explains which seats happened to be held was the strength of the main competitor. The Lib Dems held Southport and Carshalton, for instance, with shares of the vote significantly lower than they had in many of the seats they won, because the main competitor was weaker.
But this is getting a long way from opinion polls.
Yeah,
opinion polls are not very good at telling what's going to happen in individual constituencies.
Let's move on. Gentleman over there.
David Palmer, Millbank Partners. Has there been any kind of academic study comparing British experience with the experience in other democracies along the lines of what you explained so well?
I have not seen anybody try to do it, but the British polling industry is not alone in some of the problems that it's been facing. I mean, some people are complaining about the opinion polls vis-a-vis last night's New York primary elections. They've had trouble in Greece. So it's there probably is a good PhD there for somebody to write, but I'm afraid I'm not going to write it.
Sorry. Yes, middle.
Thank you. Okay,
Sorry, behind you. Yes.
My name's John Curtice, and I'm a Labour councillor. This question is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but opinion polls always publish with a stated margin of error. It's usually plus or minus 3%. So, add 3% to the Tories, take 3% from Labour, and don't you end up with what we've got?
But the plus or minus 3% is only true for an individual poll. It is not true if you've done whatever it is, 100 and some odd opinion polls, all of which basically say on average it's even Stevens. The margin of error on that is a decimal point or two, right? So it's if you've got repeated measures, then the margin of error, which again the polling industry is now being asked to really rethink, because that margin of error is very rough and ready, is only applies to an individual poll. So that's why people like me say, well, if you get one poll that says the Labour vote's gone up 2%, you go, well, maybe, but I need a lot more polls to tell me. If you get 6 polls, 7 polls, 8 polls, all saying Labour's gone up 2%, individually they're not significant, but something's happened.
Yeah. At the front here.
Thank you very much. A couple of points raised from previous ones.
Are you deliberately anonymous?
No, I'm pretty much. John Newham, Cheap for Politics. And Vince Cable lost Twickenham, and he attributed that loss to all of the speculation about the hypothetical coalition between SNP and Labour. Now, my main couple of points. First of all, should we not remember that all the opinion polls are just a snapshot of opinion at any one time? Far too often the headlines in the newspapers give the impression this is the election result. which of course it isn't. And then again, as was mentioned a moment ago, the 3% marginal error, of course, can cause haywire as far as the electoral system is concerned. My final point is, what are the implications of all of this for the EU referendum? Because presumably, yes or
I think
no,
it's time for me to go across St James's Park.
a straightforward yes or no should presumably be easier than calculating.
No, it's not. Referendums are more difficult than general elections because at least the polling industry tries to learn from its errors, as you've seen post 2015. But this is an attempt, given that the world is so different from 1975, you can't really learn any lessons from the polls of 1975. This is in effect an attempt to try to measure something new. And there's very little guidance about how to do it. Point one. Point two is, and this is the real rub for the industry, let's say for the purpose of argument, that the industry has perhaps already, at least to some extent, solved the problem. And let's say maybe we now think that their estimates of Labour and Conservative support are rather closer to the truth than they were 12 months ago. They could still get the referendum badly wrong because vote choice in the referendum cuts across voter preference. Tory voters are pretty much split 50-50. Labour voters are only about 2-1 in favour. So you can still end up with the wrong kind of Tory voters and the wrong kind of Labour voters and still get it wrong. And of course, whereas for the most part the differences between phone and internet polls were relatively minor in the election, they have been very big at earlier stages in the campaign, and they're still there. I mean, basically the phone polls call it 55-45 at the moment, and the internet polls call it 50-50, and that's a big difference. So that the industry has the industry knows it's got a problem. I mean they're actually spending money on doing it both ways in order to try to work out which way to do it, right? But it's very difficult to work out which is the way to do it, even when you've done that kind of exercise.
Reminding ourselves that they're snapshots rather than an actual.
Well, sure, of course they are. Yes, and you see it going on at the moment. The Remain side think they had a good day yesterday. And there have been 3 polls out this week that show the Remain side gaining a little bit. So people say, oh, Project Fear is already going to working. Well, these polls were taken before the latest version of Project Fear was even allowed on the airwaves. I mean, more broadly, apart from some tough questions for the polling industry, I think the lesson of 2015 does also raise questions about news values. And I know it is that maybe it'd be better to have fewer polls done over a longer period of time, and you'll get a better understanding of what's going on, and that and that indeed you need to be rather more circumspect about how you report the things.
Only 2 months to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
We're coming towards the end, aren't we, John?
Got 10 minutes, yeah.
Yes. Can I take a round up? I've got 4 people at the moment. Ben Side, Amy Dodd, I think, wanted to get in. Yes. John Cartledge and Nigel Cedar, and the gentleman there. Sorry. So I've got 5. Can we just have you 5 briefly, and then John can perhaps sum up. Ben.
Sure. So I'm Ben Side, colleague of mine. So my question to John was really, you said, John, this is a problem of kind of sampling, and in a sense the solution is the kind of gold standard of residential action. Surely the temptation for the pollsters who are unlikely to go down the route is simply to say, well, we're going to reweight our data, but just in a different way. We're going to reweight more aggressively towards kind of the other people. If that's one of the problems we've had in this election. But you also showed right at the beginning that this is not a problem just of the current election. It's a problem going back, back to 1990 to a greater or less degree.
Yeah.
So I wondered how far the problems of this election you've identified are also the problems kind of going back.
Oh, sure.
Going back in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yes. Amy.
Just a quick one. Amy Dodd, Chair of the Performance Society. It's maybe goes a little bit beyond the remit of what you were doing in your report, but I think you were alluding to.
Not my report, by the way. I just commissioned it.
Is there a little bit of a communications problem as well? If you think about how people, and you talked about a little bit already today, how people understand the polls, how well they understand how they work. We're talking about kind of average person in the public. But also this tendency both in the media and of us ourselves to actually kind of cherry pick, or the sort of confirmation bias of pick the stuff that tells the story we want it to tell. So when I've been a journalist, as we were alluding to before, pick the poll or pick the bits of the polls that tell the most interesting story. So is this something that we should be doing, you know, as kind of in the academic end or as kind of polling or something about how we address that?
Thank you. John?
Yes, John Curtice, I'm a McDougall trustee. I don't know if there's a single constituency in the country with a split of votes between parties match the national aggregates, but all your bar charts show those national aggregates. And in a first past the post election, the critical factor is how those are turned into results in individual constituencies. If you compare UKIP and other there, it's really not about the actual outcome in terms of parliamentary seats. And we've said several times, we've got 650 separate constituencies, each with their own unique characteristics and their own local contests taking place, which are determined by a variety of factors, some of which are national, some of which are local. And the polls are not very good at telling you what's happening at constituency level. If they're not very good at telling you what's happening at constituency level, and that's the level at which the election is being determined, what they are they any good at telling you at all?
Nigel?
I'm Nigel Cedar, another McDougall trustee and a voluntary sector activist. My question is very similar. It's really how far did the opinion polls underrate or overweight the effect in marginal seats, the ones that were seriously likely to change hands?
Yeah. And finally, gentleman behind John.
Guy Svensson, RF documentary films. Decades ago after college, I spent a couple of years doing doing probability sample style interviews for the NGLC. And it brought it home to all of us who did that, and perhaps this has just dropped out of the language of the biasing factors, that there was the construct then, I think, was called authoritarian paranoid personality. It was a very real thing. And it was those group of people on your third or fourth knock lifted up the letterbox and said something to encourage you to go away. And one had a strong feeling that those people's views tended to be more to the right of the spectrum than the average. And they tended, and that correlated with their disinclination to answer, to talk to strangers. And I never hear that term or that complex of behaviours as a biasing factor, but perhaps it's still acknowledged.
And I thought an authoritarian paranoid personality was illustrated by Joe Stalin, well to the left. Anyway, John, would you like to cover those five and any general summing up you'd like to do?
Sure. I think the point that a couple of people raised is, well, what are polls for? What are they estimating? National opinion polls, at least, are simply attempting to estimate the British-wide share of the vote. Nothing more, nothing less. No opinion pollster, by the way, themselves publishes a seat estimate. That is usually, and the journalist rings me up and I give them one, or they get somebody to give them one, or they work it out for themselves. But that is a projection on the evidence that's before them. Now, sometimes if you've got a very large sample, you can begin to do it quite sophisticatedly, and you might actually say, well, we expect A to be different from B. And certainly one of the things that virtually everybody did in 2015 for really the first time was to assume that Scotland would be different from the rest of England and Wales, all right? So we no longer assume uniform everywhere. We said, well, Scotland would do one thing, England would do the other. But that's what they are, all right? If you want to find out what's going on in individual constituencies, you have to try to do polls of individual constituencies, but Lord Ashcroft had just the same problem in his constituency polls. But you know, this is what the polls do. If you would prefer life to be made easier to work out what's the relationship between votes and seats, you need to change the electoral system. But that's another whole debate. And it doesn't have to be PR, by the way. You can have a deliberately disproportional allocation formula. You just need an allocation formula that links national votes to seats as opposed to not having one at all. So that's number one. Two, Ben was kind of saying, well, aren't they just basically going to go away and try and put sticking plaster on? Well, to extent true. I mean, if you read the report, it basically says, look, we appreciate that doing random probability sampling is too slow and too expensive. But as I suggested to you, there are some things that can be done. One is that, you know, maybe just spending a week rather than 2 days doing it and making a bit more effort to try to get hold of people who are more difficult, that could well improve the quality of the samples. And secondly, crucially, regarding random probability surveys as a crucial linchpin for the industry. There's nothing unique about this. I mean, the random online surveys, all right, the one that kind of Natsen has started, they basically start by doing a online sample. A random probability interviews, all right? That gives you a lot of information about those people, and it also gives you a lot of information about the people whom you don't manage to get hold of again, all right? But the original sample that's collected is random, and therefore the argument is that therefore as a result you can get quite a good result. And if you look at the American literature on this, it basically says that the issue is not a question of mode, it's a question of sampling, and that random probability online samples can be quite quick. And the potential, therefore, advantage of that approach is that you can do it quickly, which is what you're looking for. The marginal cost is also still relatively low. The difficult bit is that the fixed cost is high, all right? But at least unlike doing fresh cross-sectional face-to-face samples, at least it's not the fixed cost, it's heavy all the time. So, this is one area where things may be taken. I mean, again, an organization like Knowledge Networks in the US has invested in the effort to create a random probability internet panel, which it then has to refresh. There's an equivalent one in the Netherlands, but nobody here has invested the money required to do that, well, except that Natsen has just started to do it, but it's still quite small. So that's that I think is going to answer that. Communications problem with polls. Of course there's a confirmation bias. Look, all newspapers interpret the world in a way that they like it. So some newspapers this morning have, George Osborne delivers killer blow because it's all going to cost us 4,000 quid if we leave the EU. And other newspapers have to say, Osborne has to make, fateful admission that there's going to be a whole load of migrants if we stay inside the EU. It just depends on which side of the argument you are. And the same thing happens to opinion polls. The crucial thing about the British Polling Council, right, is that by making sure that the pollsters actually publish the underlying data, the information that the newspaper had on the web in a way that anybody can find and use and look at, they can do two things. One is they can say, well, actually, does the newspaper's interpretation look reasonable or not? And if they think it's unreasonable, they can get onto social media and off we go. And equally, they can say, that was a bloody crap poll. Why did they ask that question? They should have done that way. So great thing about the internet is therefore anybody can for themselves critically evaluate the newspaper report and the original quality of the data. And that's what the British Polling Council tries to add to the mix of this, is basically to make it possible for you to say, that story in the Daily Mirror or in the Daily Mail, whatever, is a load of crap because A, the poll is useless, and B, the journalist has misinterpreted it. You now have the ability to make that judgment for yourself. And that's the end of the advert, by the way.
Well, many thanks indeed,
Okay.
John.